well, we'll go ahead and get started then. Again, I want to welcome the various sites. There are 13 plus sites joining us today. Some are live, audio, video, some are email, and some are audio questions that they can ask us as well. I'll be explaining that part more in a little bit. So first of all, I do just want to welcome everybody to us. We have many people around the world that are joining us today. That's really our vision. We're really trying to get as many Jungian groups, organizations, communities, and individuals linked in around the world. And we've had some neat excitement about that. And this one today is one of our most successful. We've had a lot of sites worldwide joining us today, a lot of individual home computers as well. And we really want to thank everybody here today. We do hope to continue growing the community of Jungian folks involved with us, and everyone here and in the audio visual world is a part of that today. So thank you. I want to let folks know there are 17 countries participating with us today, and those countries include the United States, Canada, Mexico, the UK, France, Spain, Norway, Belgium, Sweden, Estonia, Ireland, Switzerland, Netherlands, Israel, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia. So that just gives people a sense of the global connectivity that we're striving for today. And then thank everybody, especially the far distant countries checking in. That is such a blessing to have you with us today as well. A couple quick thanks I would like to offer. First of all, UNCA, the University of North Carolina, Asheville, is our main host today, and we really want to thank them for this. None of this would be possible were not for them behind the scenes doing the technological pieces. So that includes the Distance Learning Center, which is where we're broadcasting from today, as well as the Department of Psychology and what's called the NC-REN system out of Raleigh, which is the hub connecting all these worldwide sites. So a strong thank you to them. The Philemon Foundation is a group I'd like to highlight as well today. Many of you know about the Philemon Foundation, some of you probably don't. Their main task is offering the works of Carl Jung to a broad audience. They were instrumental in the collected works as those came together. But the collected works of Carl Jung aren't the only writings that he has done or that need to be published. A good example, of course, is the Red Book, and the Red Book we'll be talking about a lot today. But they've done quite a bit in getting his works out to the public. They've been very instrumental in the Red Book. We want to thank them for that. The Red Book itself, the original Red Book, has been in the Rubin Museum in New York City. At some point, it will be at the Hammer Museum at UCLA, which is in April, I believe, it will be coming there. And if anybody would like further information, PhilemonFoundation.org will let you know about that project. If you get a chance to see it in person, I hear it's an amazing experience as well. We have numerous organizations joining us today. Those include the Analytical Psychology Society of Western New York, the C.G. Jung Center in Evanston, the Conscious Choice Corporation, Jung Cleveland, the Hayden Institute, Canuga Conference Center, Jung Center of Houston, Centro Mexicano de C.G. Jung, San Antonio Jung Center, Santa Fe Center for Alchemical Studies, C.G. Jung Center of C.G. Jung Society of Sarasota, Argosy University, C.G. Jung Society of Seattle, Sonoma State University, and the Institute of Noetic Sciences. All of those sites are plugged in live to us, so they are involved with this as we speak. Pacifica University will also be on a tape-delayed connection, but will be joining us in the afternoon, in essence. Please visit our website, AshevilleYoungCenter.org, and it will tell more about our vision, some of the DVDs of the seminars we've already done. This is our 7th, I believe, seminar we've done, and do visit us. The local folks have been warned by wanting to let everybody in the other sites know that we are taping the conference today. The seminar should be available on DVD within a few months. But that does mean if anybody asks a question and is a strong introvert and does not want to be recorded, please ask the question via writing, write out the question, give it to the host of the place where you're at, and they will in turn ask the question. So otherwise, if you don't mind being on tape, please ask the question directly, if possible. Do turn off all cell phones if you don't mind, or at least put them on vibration for the clinicians that might need access to them. But do remember to check that. We have 9 what we call fully interactive sites today, where they can interact with us with audio and possibly video. We have 4 email-connected sites that will interact more with email. They will hear and see us fully, but if they have questions for us, I'm going to ask them to email it to me, and I will read as many of those as possible, to Dr. Stein. And our email address you should have, but if not, it's info@ashevilleyoungcenter.org. You've sent out lots of emails, so I think all the sites have that site, but that's where you send them to. And please do give us any feedback of how we're doing. Send us emails after the fact. Let us know kind of how things have been from your perspective. Okay, we're almost ready. 2 more quick things. First of all, the schedule today that we've mapped out is Dr. Stein will be lecturing for 50 to 60 minutes. We will then go for about a 20-minute block for questions that will be at a few of the sites at a time. We will do a 10-minute break and reconvene for a 30-minute teaching, 15-minute Q&A, 30-minute teaching, 15-minute. You don't need to know that for sure to memorize, but just know that there will be a break halfway through, and there will be 3 blocks of times for questions and answers. And we hope to get to all the sites at least once for questions, and hopefully twice, for that. Okay, well again, thank you. Let's introduce Dr. Murray Stein. Many of you know Dr. Murray Stein. He has been our lead presenter, for the majority of the seminars we've done thus far. He is the current president of the International School of Analytical Psychology, Zurich, which is one of the premier Zurich institutes, for Jungian studies. He may talk more about that if he gets a chance. If anybody can get to Zurich to study out there, either at their Jungian Odyssey, which is an intensive week-long program, or for their other happenings, it's an excellent experience. He was, for a number of years, the president of the International Association of Analytical Psychology. That is the large, organizing body of all Jungian analysts, and was head of that for a while. He is a ordained Presbyterian minister and integrates spirituality into his practice. He is a founding member of 2 Jungian institutes, and most important, he is truly a gifted, lecturer and teacher. Anybody's heard Murray Stein, you know how he can take enormously complex material and really distill it down into very understandable pieces, and can really connect well with all Jungians of a different walk. And if anybody's looked at the Red Book, you know how complex and intense that is, and we're very much looking forward to Dr. Stein helping us with that. So, without further ado, if the technology permits, we would like to turn it over to Dr. Stein. When we switch for questions, I will be the host for the questions, and I will be asking the different sites to chime in. But for now, let's turn it over to Murray from Zurich. Thank you, Murray.
Thanks, Steve. A heavy book, the Red Book.
Yes, it is. Mine right here, too.
A real tome. It's a great honor and privilege to be able to share with you some of my thoughts. I've been studying diligently, reading the Red Book since it came out, especially over the holidays. And I must say I've been totally absorbed in it, fascinated, obsessed, waking up in the middle of the night thinking about it, trying to put it together, and as you say, trying to boil it down to present to you today in some bite-sized chunks. I'm sure I'll be defeated, and I will not be successful in this because it is an enormous work, enormously complicated, with many implications and so much fascinating material. But I will try to give you an overview, and in the course of things to answer questions that I've put up here on the board. What is the Red Book? Why did C.G. Jung make it, do it, create it? How did he create it? And what's in it? So that'll take us about 3 hours to cover, I figure. First of all, what is the Red Book? Someone asked me this question recently, and I've been pondering it ever since and trying to put it into a nutshell. What is it really? And what sort of genre does it belong to in the history of human beings' writings and reflections and bookmaking? I finally came to what I would say, what I consider a kind of brief and succinct definition of it, that the Red Book is a highly stylized record of a midlife man's dialogue with his soul. And I'll say some more about that. It's highly stylized in that it is incredibly artistic and beautifully created. I'll tell you about how Jung did this, how he made it. And I'll try to say something about what it contains, what that dialogue contains. What was Jung doing as he entered into this engagement with his own inner life, and why did he do it? As for genre, what I've come up with in thinking about that is the title of a book that Jim Hillman edited a long time ago and put together, published in 1968 by Northwestern University Press, called Timeless Documents of the Soul. And I think this will eventually go into that genre as a timeless document of the soul. It's not really a literary work, it's not really a philosophical or even a psychological work. It's a soul work. It is a document it's a record of a man's encounter with his soul, with his inner life, and what he experienced in that encounter. In that book, Timeless Documents of the Soul, there is a 4,000-year-old, a translation of a 4,000-year-old Egyptian text called the Dialogue of a World-Weary Man with His Ka. And when I associated to that book, I went back and read that text, and it's uncannily similar to what Jung produced in what we're calling the Red Book. A depressed man, more or less at the middle of life, discouraged with his times, seeing that religion isn't working anymore, that traditions are breaking down, that he can't make sense of his own life or the life of his culture around him, decides to commit suicide. And in his quiet meditations and deliberations, he is confronted by his soul, which the Egyptians called the Ka. It's the immortal soul implanted within each of us who has its home elsewhere, and it looks at our life from a very different point of view, from the view of infinity, of the divine. And as this man is about to commit his act of ending his life, the Ka enters into an engagement with him, and they have a discussion and a dialogue, and in the end they become friends and brothers, and the man decides to go on with his life after all. Wonderful document, testimonial to this kind of inner work. And so 4,000 years later, Jung produced what we're now calling the Red Book, or the Liber Novus, as he called it, the new book. What is it? As I said, it's a record. It's a record of an encounter that took place over a period of time, relatively short period of time. And I'll give you the history of all that. And it is an example, first example, if you will, of what Jung would later call active imagination. Now, as to why he did this, why did he enter into this kind of dialogue with his soul? Well, he was at midlife. Like the world-weary man, he was rather depressed with the way things had been going lately. And so he decided to go to another level. He'd been living at one level with what he calls in the book the spirit of the times, and now he drops to another level. And just to explain a bit of why he does that, you have to know a little bit about Jung's life and where he was in his life's trajectory at this particular moment. The Red Book begins on the 12th of November, 1913. And if we back up from that date, we see that Jung was in a very particular place in his life. He was born in 1875, so in 1913 he was 38 years old. In 1900, at the age of 25, he came to Zurich and entered the Burghölzli Clinic as a psychiatric student and resident. He studied there with famous psychiatrist named Eugen Bleuler. He did his scientific studies with the word association experiment. He published very early, became famous very early with his writings and his books. And in 1907, he went and visited Freud in Vienna, and they hit it off, and he became an early member of the Freudian circle and a leader of those early days of psychoanalysis in Europe. And he became the champion of it, and he went out and he defended Freud at all the psychiatric congresses in Europe. Freud declared him his crown prince, and really his way out into the wider world of psychiatry and out of the Jewish ghetto that Freud lived in his close circle, friends and colleagues in Vienna. And so Jung was very important to Freud, and they traveled together to the United States in 1909 to Clark University, and 1910 Jung became the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He was the editor of the Jahrbuch, the yearbook, the major publication for psychoanalysis, and every year they had a congress. He was very actively involved. And then he started departing from some of Freud's theories, and they had a falling out and a major dispute when in 1912, actually it was published in, I've got all this here in front of me, on the in September of 1912, Jung published the part 2 of Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, the transformations and symbols of the libido. And in that book, he really took issue with some of Freud's fundamental doctrines and theories. And so when Freud read this and responded to it, they had an exchange of letters, and it became quite acrimonious, and the dispute sharpened, and finally in December of 1912, Jung wrote a letter of protest to Freud, a very sharp and defensive letter, saying that Freud didn't really understand him, underestimated his work, was afraid of being usurped and passed over, and so on and so forth. And on the 6th of January 1913, now we're entering into 1913, the critical year, on the 6th of January, Jung wrote his final letter to Freud, his final personal letter to Freud, the last sentence of which is, "Der Rest ist Schweigen," a quotation from Hamlet, "the rest is silence." And so they never exchanged much in the way of personal dialogue or words after that. Nevertheless, they did meet again at a congress in September of 1913 in Munich. It's the last time they would meet. It was a very difficult congress, very tense. Jung was re-elected president, more or less over the protest of the Viennese and Freud. Nevertheless, he was re-elected. And but he had to decide what to do. Would he want to go on with this, what he had started with the psychoanalysts and with Freud, or did he need to find another way? On the 27th of October, he writes a letter to Freud, an official letter resigning his editorship in the Jahrbuch, in the journal. He had been the first and only editor to that point. And in that letter, he says that he had heard through another source that Freud was questioning his bona fides, his fidelity, his good faith, and therefore he felt he couldn't work anymore in this position as editor of the Jahrbuch, and he resigned it. That was the 27th of October. On the 12th of November, this would be roughly 2 weeks later, he has his first, what we call active imagination, the first entry into the black books that will then become the material that he uses to create the Red Book a couple of years later. And this period of time, from the 12th of November 1913 until the 19th of April 1914, comprises the entire span of all the material, of all the primary material, let's say, all the lava, all the source material that is in the Red Book. So that's a period of about 4 or 5 months. On the 19th of April, he concludes with the sentence that ends the what is called the Liber Secundus, the second part of the Red Book, which we'll talk about later, with the words, "This is the way." And the next day, he sends a letter to the IPA and he resigns his presidency from the IPA. So why did he do it? He was struggling with a decision. Should he go on doing what he had been doing in the world? And through this inner work, this meditation, these active imaginations, he came to the decision, no, this is not the way. I have another way. I've found another way. And we'll see what that is as we go into the contents of the Red Book. What did he find? What is his way? Why did he resign? Because he found a very different way from anything that he'd been pursuing before that time. And so the day after he finishes the active imaginations that comprise the Red Book, he resigns as president of the IPA, leaves the psychoanalytic movement altogether, and about a week later, on the 30th of April, he writes to the University of Zurich and he resigns his position in the medical school on the faculty of the University of Zurich. So again, he leaves another position, another worldly position, and now he's really on his own. He's on a totally different path than he had been professionally before this time. And so you can attribute to his inner work these decisions to leave, to go another way. Very important, very critical moment in his life. Then to the question, how did he do it? How did he create this book? Those are some of the dates that I've just mentioned. We don't need to go into that. How did he create this book? There are layers to it, or levels. When he started out with his active imaginations on that fateful November day in 1913, he simply recorded his images and conversations and dialogues in a journal, and these were called the Black Books. He had been keeping a record of some of his observations, insights, whatever thoughts, maybe some dreams in Black Books for a period of time, perhaps since he was a student at the University of Basel. And these Black Books are the container then of all the material that transpires between the beginning and the end of his active imagination work. Actually, what I've discovered that the Black Books contain material relevant to the Red Book starting in 1913 and extending to 1930. And we'll see how that material got woven into what eventually became the Red Book. So the first level is the experiences themselves. That's the source. The second level is the record of those experiences as recorded in the Black Books. And this record was created between 1913, 1914, and onward until 1930, where Jung continued to keep a journal of his active imaginations and commentaries on them. And in 1914, he decided to create what he called a draft of the material to that date, a draft. Sonu Shamdasani, in his very interesting introduction to the Red Book contained in this edition, gives a very careful account of all these levels and how they fit together and how Jung created this document. So in this draft, what's called the draft is basically a typescript from the Black Books, is made up of about 50% material from the Black Books and about 50% later commentary. The first level from in the black books was mostly just the experience.
What does it mean?
A narrative of the experience. He then added commentary to that, and that commentary also went into this draft. He then created a corrected draft, a second draft, which edited the version of the first draft, mostly in the commentary section. He didn't do much editing in what we could call the primary section, that is the actual experience, an account of the actual experiences. The editing that he did took place in the commentary. And then he decided to take this another step, and in 1915, now mind you, World War I started on August 1st, 1914. So most of what is, or a lot of what is contained in the Red Book was done while Jung sat out the First World War, basically, in Switzerland. People have asked, how could he do such a time-consuming work, a busy man as he was? One of the answers is he did quite a bit of it during the war when he couldn't travel. People couldn't leave the country, they couldn't come in, they couldn't go out. He probably didn't have so many patients during that time. Certainly no foreign patients were coming in. He had resigned his position at the university. He was no longer working at the Berkeley Clinic. And so he had some time on his hands. And in 1915, he decided to begin putting this material that he had gathered in these drafts into a particular form. And that's one of the most astonishing things about this whole work is the form that he chose. Now, at first, in the first effort that he made, he created what in the book is called the Liber Primus. This book, Liber Primus, that's the first part of 3 parts of the Red Book. And this material was transcribed, as you see, in a very careful text with beautiful illuminated letters and so on parchment. These were pieces of parchment that he took or bought somewhere, and he started recording in this very small script, as you can see, with a few illustrations. He started recording the material that he had gathered in the draft. This combination of active imagination and commentary. Well, it turned out that the parchment didn't hold ink very well. It didn't absorb ink, and so it started flaking, and he realized he couldn't go on with parchment. So that's when he went out and bought, quotes, the Red Book. And the Red Book is something that does look like this. It's about this size. These are actual photographed pages from the Red Book. So this is a facsimile version of the Red Book, and this is the way it actually looks in the Red Book. Large pages like this, and filled with paintings and calligraphy. And so when he bought the Red Book, brought that home, he pasted in the vellum pages, the parchment pages, in the front of it, and he started a second section, and that's called the Liber Secundus, the second book. So those are the 2 sections of the Red Book, the Liber Primus and the Liber Secundus. And as he created the Liber Secundus, you can see he made it even more artistic and more elaborate, and with very tiny calligraphic writing, beautiful illuminated manuscript-like pages with the letters and all, and then, of course, the amazing and, for us, fascinating pictures of figures. And some of these pictures that he painted and put in here were illustrations of figures from the text. For instance, this is Isdubar. Isdubar is a character who presents himself to Jung at a certain point in his active imaginations. And to illustrate the text that accompanies this, there you have a picture of Isdubar. Other paintings, for instance, some of these later ones, have relatively little connection to the text. Some illustrate the text or are loosely connected to the text, but they're fascinating and wonderful paintings. And this work, the painting and the creation of this, went on into the 1920s. And finally, at the end of it, this is, I think, the last painting that Jung did of this Chinese-like looking mandala, 1927. And he inserted that into the text. Doesn't have very much to do with what's going on in the text, but it's a very important moment in his own development, because shortly after that, Richard Wilhelm sent him a copy of The Secret of the Golden Flower to write a commentary for, plus some Chinese mandalas, and suddenly Jung realized, oh, I'm not alone in this. People from the other side of the world I've had no idea, no contact with, have done similar type of thing. And so he became very interested in Chinese thought and eventually in alchemy. And at the end of the Prima Secundus, the last page, which he probably wrote in the, maybe in the late 1920s, I'm not so sure just about the dating of this, he just stops in mid-sentence. So the book ends, it's a kind of fragment. He doesn't put nearly everything that's in the black books into the red book. And in fact, the red book, if you go and look at it in one of these exhibitions in the United States, you'll see that there are many, many empty pages after the end of the script. So he left himself room to go on with it, to put more of his text from the black books in there if he would have wanted to, more paintings and so on. But he says he just lost interest in it, or he just, it stops. And the reason he gives for that is he developed a very strong interest in alchemy at that time. 1928, 1930, he begins studying alchemy intensively, and he puts this off. It also slows down considerably around 1920 when he buys the land on the upper lake of Zurich and creates Bollingen, his retreat. And we'll see as we go through the contents of the Red Book why the retreat was so important for Jung and what that meant. Building that tower is intimately linked with what he experienced in the active imaginations that are recorded in the Red Book. And so the tower, in a sense, is an extension, another type of, I think he calls it a testament to the self, or it's a symbolic building that grew out of his inner experiences and active imaginations, and it also has levels and layers, and it was built in stages, and it really represents, it's another form of representation of the self. So it's very complicated how he made this book and all the layers and levels. I don't want to go into too much more detail. We could spend a whole seminar on that subject alone if we really wanted to look at it carefully. What I find quite wonderful about this edition is that it is more than the Red Book itself. One could say, this is not the Red Book. Like this is not a pipe, famous painting by Magritte. This is not the Red Book. The Red Book, if you want to see it, is in a museum in New York. This is a good bit more than the Red Book. This is the Red Book Plus. So there's a facsimile of the Red Book, and then there is a long and very interesting, detailed introduction to the Red Book by Sonu Shamdasani. And then there's a translation of the Red Book in English. It's also in German. I have the German edition. I read most of it myself in German, actually. There are some issues with translation, as there always are. I won't say this is an incorrect or an unreliable translation, but I'll point out a few things where it could have been different, or translators had to make a choice, and you miss some of the nuances of some of the language in the English. But there is an English translation of the text in this book, and then there is a third section that is not in the Red Book, that in the translation is called Scrutinies, And that is another chunk from the black books that Jung did not include in his Red Book, but he made a separate manuscript, a separate draft, if you will, and that's in German it's called Prüfungen. The English translation, they chose the word scrutinies. I don't think it's so great, but I'll go into that a little bit later. Prüfungen contains a kind of extension of the Red Book, going further into the dialogues with Philemon. Philemon comes back as a very important figure in the Prüfungen, in the scrutinies. He's not a very significant figure. He's important, but he isn't a big figure, a central figure so much in the Red Book itself, but in the Prüfungen, he's really the central figure. And the 7 Sermons to the Dead are in the Prüfungen. So, plus a kind of beautiful conclusion in a garden where Philemon is present, Christ enters the garden, Jung is there, and they have a discussion. And this is the end of the Prüfungen. This is sort of the capstone of the whole story. And Christ looks at Philemon and says, "Oh, I know who you are. You're Simon Magus. You were one of my early followers." Simon Magus was one of the early Christians, first century, Simon the magician. And Simon Magus and Helen, a young, beautiful young woman, traveled around the world together and gave lessons and did magic and so on. And so Philemon is a kind of extension or another representation, Philemon and Bacchus, Helen and Simon Magus. And so it's a Christ in the garden, Simon Magus and Jung, and at the end they speak about the beauty of Christ, that Christ taught us the beauty of suffering. And that's the end of the whole work, the beauty of suffering. The end of the Liber Secundus, the end of the last sentence in the Red Book itself, or in that material, it isn't even included in the Red Book, but it's in the Red Book material, is "This is the way." And so the first part illustrates the way, or talks about the way, what is the way, and the second part has a lot more material about kind of, in the 7 sermons, a kind of cosmogony, a worldview, and some other very visionary material. In addition to all that, there are some addenda and appendices in here that are very interesting and important, with mandala paintings and so on. And also Sonu Shamdasani's footnotes. I think I've read every one of them. Those I read in English because that's his language, and he wrote them in English. They were then translated into German for the German edition. Again, there are problems with translation going that way. But he has included a wealth of material in these 250 or so footnotes. And in those, he often cites passages from the black books that Jung chose not to include in the Red Book. So when Jung was making the Red Book and going through the drafts that he had created from the black books, he would leave out certain sections, or he'd leave out names. And Sonu has managed to bring these all back into, so that you can see what Jung was doing. Why did he leave this out? We don't really know. I discussed that actually this morning with his grandson Ulrich Herney, and Herney told me his fantasy was that Jung, Emma, and Tony Wolfe sat around trying to decide, is this appropriate? Is it redundant? Should I include it? Should I leave it out? Kind of a team effort. First time I ever heard anything like that. I thought this was all Jung himself, but he did include some other people. He showed some of his patients what he was doing as he was doing this. There are some diaries that his patients kept where they will say, oh, on such and such a date, Jung showed me that he was painting this picture, and Sonu has managed to track down a lot of these things and say, well, you know, this was Tina Keller. Tina Keller was in his office that day because Sonu had his calendar, she saw him that day, and that's what he was working on that day. So this is what she's writing about in her diary. Very interesting additions that you wouldn't find in the original, in the real Red Book, you've got in this edition. The other thing to say about the Red Book is that when Jung bought that, I guess you could call it a huge journal, empty pages, on the spine he had imprinted Liber Novus, the new book. So, it's for me, it's still an open question. What does the Red Book mean? What did it mean for Jung? Why did he put so much time into it? But I think he felt it was something terribly important to invest so much energy into it. To call it by that name, Liber Novus, makes you think, well, this is like a New Testament, or this has something to do with a very new document of the soul that is pointing toward the future. And there's a lot of discussion in here about the future, envisioning the future, the religion of the future, where is it's a kind of prophecy in a sense, or there are prophetic passages in it. And so as this material came to Jung, I think he started feeling that he was privy to visions of the future that didn't come from a rational source. It isn't something you read in the newspaper or you read in books. It came from other sources. And one of the reasons he thought that this might be the case, that these are actually premonitions of something to come, is that he had this strange experience just before starting writing the Red Book. Sonu comments on that extensively in his introduction. In 1912, this is about a year before he started the Active Imaginations, Jung was riding on a train from Schaffhausen to Zurich. That's about an hour's train trip. And his mother-in-law lived in Schaffhausen. Emma came from this family in Schaffhausen, and he was probably on a visit up there, or on business or something. And he was coming back on the train, and on that train trip, he went into a kind of trance and scared himself. He said that he saw a map of Europe, and it was like blood flowing all over the map. From the north to the south, but the blood stopped at the Alps. The Alps prevented it from going further, so it didn't really come all the way in and cover Switzerland. So that was one of those strange experiences. Then in the spring of 1914, I think on 3 successive months, April, May, June, something like that, Sonu again has all the details about this. He had a similar vision, but this time it's that Europe was frozen, that an Arctic freeze had descended on Europe, and it was absolutely barren, winter, everything dead. And he thought, maybe these are signs I'm losing it, I'm becoming psychotic. He thought of his patients, he thought of his family history. There was some of this kind of mental illness in his family and in previous generations. So he was really worried that something bizarre, he was losing control of his psyche, of his thoughts. And then when World War I broke out on August 1st, 1914, he had a very paradoxical reaction. He was actually in England giving some lectures at the time, and he couldn't get back because when the war broke out, they stopped all the transportation back into Europe briefly, and then he came back later. But he said he felt a kind of relief, because now he knew that those visions weren't about just his own personal material, but they had something to do with what was going on in the collective, under the surface. Hardly anybody expected World War I to break out. I mean, it was more or less a conclusion on the part of most people that war could never happen again. People were too civilized nowadays. But then all of a sudden it did break out after the assassination of the Crown Prince of Austro-Hungarian Empire in Serbia. And suddenly war fervor was all over Europe, and people were very happily and very joyfully and gaily going into military service for the fatherland and so on in this insanity broke out, and some of the active imaginations that Jung had previous to that, already in January and February, where he has a vision of death and all the material from a whole generation is coming rolling down a hill into the sea. These kinds of graphic images of death and experiences of death and the coldness of death suddenly took on another dimension, and he felt, well, maybe I'm not so crazy after all. It was confirmed that something else, something bigger than himself was going on. And so I think one of the reasons he put so much into this Red Book was that he thought that maybe at some level what he's experiencing in these experiences, in these visions, dialogues, reflections that are going on with in his encounter with these inner figures, do have some relevance beyond himself. Now, he did not publish the Red Book in his lifetime, and there was a lot of debate, I guess, about whether he should or not. It was under consideration in at certain periods in his life. Should he publish it or should he keep it private? He showed it to some close friends, actually copies. I don't know how they made copies in those days. Today it's not so difficult to make photocopies of things, but some copies were made. Perhaps they were copies of the typescript, or what they call the draft. Or the H.G. Baines had a copy, and well, there were 4 or 5 copies circulating. So other people had seen. He showed James Kirsch, his good friend from Los Angeles at that time, or later. James Kirsch read the Red Book, saw it. Other people in his close circle saw it, but he was very hesitant about publishing it. And it was because he was really, I think, afraid that it would give the wrong impression. He had built up a great persona as a scientific man, as a man of substance, as an intellectual, and I think he was afraid that if it was revealed what his inner life was like, the contrast between that and his official personality and persona would be so great. People would be shocked, or they would think, truly, this is a bizarre man, that he would entertain such kinds of images and put so much effort into that. So at any rate, he decided not to publish it in his lifetime, and he gave it to his family upon his death for their safekeeping. His son Franz Jung had it in his library. He lived in Jung's house until his death, 1996, and he would occasionally show it to a few people, but it was very, very strictly guarded against public inspection. And then upon his death, it was handed over to the trustees of the family, to the Urban Gemeinschaft, and they put it in a vault in one of the Zurich banks, in the UBS actually. And there it lay until a decision was made to publish it around the year 2000. And that decision was made for a number of reasons which are mentioned in the book, some personal family reasons, but also a feeling that maybe the public would be prepared nowadays to accept this, especially in such a beautiful and scholarly version. So the family did work closely with Sonu Shamdasani, who is the editor, to ensure that it's a text that has high scholarly merit, that it's not interpretive, it's simply a historical document with an apparatus around it, the footnotes and the introductions and so on, that give it a context. But interpretation will be left for others. And I'll give you a little bit of an interpretation today as we go into the contents, but I'm not going to be heavy on interpretation. I'm going to try to, in the time that we have, give you some of the highlights of what's in the book. We've talked about what is the Red Book, why did he do it, how did he do it. Now we come to the question of what's in it. What are the contents? And there's so much there that I can't possibly give you a detailed exposition, but I will try to hit some of the highlights and at least give you an introduction to what's there and a framework for going more deeply into it for yourselves. This is the kind of book that one could sit around a table like this with a group of colleagues for a long time and go through it slowly and put it together and go more deeply into it. There are so many points of interest and such a wealth of thought and as well as the graphic parts of it, the beautiful pictures. One can spend a great deal of time looking at the pictures in all their beautiful detail and wondering, about the symbolism and looking up references and so on. So what I'd like to cover before we go to questions in a few minutes is the Liber Primus. And then in the following 30-minute time frame for my next presentation, I will try to cover Liber Secundus, about the first 2/3 of it, and then in the third 30-minute segment I will cover the rest of Liber Secundus, and if we have time, the Prüfungen, or the scrutinies. So let me just start quickly with the Liber Primus and take maybe 10 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes. Not much I can do in that time with it. But and then we'll open up for some questions from you all out there in the world. So many sites today. I want to run quickly through the narrative. The Liber Primus is the first part. This is the part that Jung did on parchment. It has 11 chapters in it, or 11, they're called chapters in this book. They're actually each dated, and the dates run from the 12th of November to the 25th of December, so a little over a month. And this is called the way of what is to come, der Weg des Kommenden. Now, way is one of the most important words throughout, way, or der Weg in German. What is the way? This section is called der Weg des Kommenden, the way, and again, here you come to a translation issue. You could translate that as they did, the way of what is to come. There's nothing wrong with that. Or you could translate it as the way of the one who is coming. The one who is coming. Des Kommenden could be a reference to a person. But it does have something to do with the way of what is to come. And I think their translation choice is not so bad there. And in that section, he introduces this issue of the spirit of the times and the spirit of the deep. He had been living the spirit of the times. That's Freudian psychology, that's psychiatry, that's the university, that's the IPA, all the spirit of the times. Very up to date, very avant-garde, very with it. Okay, that he is putting aside, and the spirit of the deep is calling him. Where does the spirit of the deep go? Into the darkness. He has no idea. This is a total mystery. So this contrast between the two spirits, the spirit of the times, which is horizontal and extends outward, and the spirit of the deep, which goes downward and is very individual, very solitary. And then it opens up with a confession of a midlife crisis. Here he is at the middle of life. He's achieved a lot, but he feels he's really lost his way. He's lost his soul. So the first section is called, the first chapter, Refinding the Soul, Die Wiederfindung der Seele, the recovery of the soul. So he feels like he's been very successful in his life. He's gone a long ways, but it's been persona, it's been surface, it's been his intellect. And where's the soul in all this? So now he wants to go in search of the soul, to recover the soul. Wiederfindung means to find again. Refinding, they translate it. You could also say recovery, the recovery of the soul. And so he follows the spirit of the deep, and it becomes an inward journey. And then there's a chapter called Soul and God, where he's meditating on the soul. The soul is a child. He discovers that the soul is a little girl and needs to be served. This soul figure comes up throughout. She's one of the main figures, not always in the same form, but Die Seele becomes his companion throughout. This work has been compared to a number of other works, among them the Divine Comedy of Dante. Of course, there are differences. Jung doesn't really have a guide throughout. There are several different guides. Different figures come along. Some he rejects, some he goes with. If there is one figure that develops and more or less accompanies him, it would be Die Seele, the soul. It's a feminine figure. She comes and she goes. Sometimes he trusts her, sometimes he doesn't. This work has also been compared to Zarathustra, to Nietzsche. And that's because Jung was so absorbed in Nietzsche, and the rhetoric of the book sounds like Nietzsche. To the German speaker and the German reader, they say, well, this is another version of Zarathustra. It has that kind of exalted, inflated, rhetorical sparkle to it. Some people like it, some people hate it. Jung himself didn't like it. He complains about it, but he has to accept it in there. He says, either I go with it or it abandons me. So he let it unfold. And that's the method that he uses. He calls it Geschehen lassen, letting it happen. You might not like it. You might find it extremely distasteful, ugly even. And he finds many ugly things in his journey. But he has to follow it, because if you stop following it, where are you? Then you're left back on the surface. You're left again with the spirit of the time. So if you want to go with the spirit of the deep, you have to follow it and accept what comes along. Then he enters the desert in chapter 4, and he experiences in the desert quite a long period of time, I think 25 days or so. He says he's in the desert, and there he has to overcome his fear of scorn and his self-scorning attitude, because he doesn't understand what he's doing. He doesn't respect what he's doing. He thinks it's stupid. He thinks he's wasting his time. He doesn't like the rhetoric, doesn't like the language, and he's fighting himself. But he has to overcome that fear of scorn. And in one passage he says, in a funny way, well, if you don't scorn yourself, other people will scorn you, so it's better to start yourself. A kind of self-ironic attitude that he carries with him throughout. And the difference between Jung's Red Book and Nietzsche's Zarathustra is that Jung's ego is fully in it, and he brings himself into it. If you read Zarathustra, Also sprach Zarathustra by Nietzsche, what you get is the preaching of a great prophet. Nietzsche just opened himself up and let it flow through him, but he didn't confront it. He didn't interact with it. Zarathustra speaks, where's Nietzsche? Nietzsche is invisible. In the Red Book, Jung is fully present throughout. He's the main actor. It's all about him and his confrontation with these figures. So it's very different from, it's more like the dialogue between the world-weary man with his Ba, because there it's a confrontation with the other. And that's what this is. So when he goes into the wilderness and confronts all these figures, he really brings himself into it. And there is a chapter 5 called Descent into Hell in the Future, which is a mistranslation. That really is wrong. It's Höllenfahrt in die Zukunft. It should be Höllenfahrt is a descent into hell. It's a descent. It's a going down into the underworld, but into the future, in die Zukunft, not the in the future in another time, but it's a journey into the future. So as he goes down, he starts discovering or looking around and seeing that the future is revealed in these dark caves, in these places. And that's where he goes into a cave. There is a stone. He lifts up the stone. He looks down and sees a stream of water flowing. In the water, horrible, grisly sight, a severed head, and then behind it a scarabus, a beetle, Egyptian beetle signifying rebirth, and the rebirth of the sun in the morning. And that's his first entry into the deeps, into the depths, going into the cave. So he's been able, by overcoming his fear of scorn, his self-scorning attitude, to go deeper. Now he's got an entry into something that he didn't even know existed before. And then there's an inner war, splitting of the spirit. A civil war rages between reason and the soul. And then the famous dream of killing Siegfried. He has to kill the hero, or the heroic attitude, he says. If you don't kill the heroic attitude, you can't overcome, he says later, the tendency to imitate, to mimic others, which is what he was doing before, imitating Freud or imitating his teachers, learning stuff from books, all secondhand knowledge, for the sake of grandiosity, for the sake of his ambition, for the sake of getting somewhere, his career building, all of that. You have to sacrifice all of that in order to find your own way. So the sacrifice of the hero means giving up your ambition, giving up your desire to get to the top and to be famous and to be really basically undoing your narcissistic ego needs. And so that is really the ticket to entry, that killing the hero, Siegfried, becomes his entry point into what in chapter 9 is called Mysterium Encounter. And this is where he meets the first two really important figures of the whole journey, Elijah and Salome, and their serpent. These three figures will take part throughout the Red Book. They come back again and again. And Salome really becomes the soul, figure of his soul. Elijah eventually becomes the wise man, the teacher, Philemon later. And the snake, the serpent, becomes Jung's friend. And that is the key development in the second book, where Jung can make the serpent his friend, because the serpent grounds him in this life and grounds him in instinct, so he doesn't fly away and he doesn't just become all words and hot air. So he has to accept the serpent. But here it makes its first appearance, and he's afraid of it. He just sees these figures, he finds out who they are, and he has an encounter with them. And then in chapter 10, called Instruction, Belehrung, Elijah, he learns that Elijah, from Salome, Salome tells him that she is his sister soul, that Elijah is his father, his spiritual father, the archetypal father. And then Jung asks, but who's our mother? You're my sister, who's our mother? And here you have Jung's naivete, as though, these are real people. He's talking, you tell me you're my sister and that's my father? Well, who's our mother then? Put her on the spot. And she says, surprisingly, Maria. Maria's our mother. And Jung said, what? Maria's our mother? That means I'm Christ. I'm not Christ. And he starts arguing with her. She says, yes, you are. And he says, oh, pooh. You're nothing but symbols. And they look at him and they say, we're not symbols. We're real. And he is astonished because he can't dismiss them as, quotes, mere symbols. Now he has to take them on their own terms. He has to encounter them. He has to dialogue with them. And then you have the famous chapter 11, which I knew about more or less beforehand, because Jung tells the story of what happened in this active imagination in his 1925 seminars at the Psychological Club. That's been published for some years now. And this is an incredible scene where he goes back and he sees the two snakes, a dark snake and a white snake, fighting with each other. And eventually they come to terms with each other, and one takes on some of the coloration of the other one, and they make a passage for him, and he goes in and he finds Elijah, and there's Salome and their snake following. And then he realizes that Salome is blind, and he has a vision. They take him up to a high place, and he has a vision of the crucifixion. And it is so vivid. He watches Christ being crucified on Good Friday, and it's so vivid, and he bursts into tears, and he has this deep empathy for the suffering Christ. And then he notices that he himself is turning into a crucified figure, and the serpent is winding around him, and his head is turning into the head of a lion, so becoming a monstrous, strange figure, but in the image of the crucified Christ. And at that moment, Salome looks at him and prays to him as though he were the Christ, and she says, "Heal me." And he scoffs her. "What do you mean, heal you? I'm not a healer." And lo and behold, she gets her sight back and she can see. She is healed. And Jung is amazed by this, and then they look at Elijah, and he's turning into a flame of fire, and she kneels down in front of him, and Jung can't take any more, and he runs out into the dark night. And that's the end of Liber Primus. I mean, you could make an opera out of this. This is fantastic material, this descent into the underworld, meeting these figures. When Jung comments on this in that seminar, he says, well, this is a deification ceremony. A deification ceremony. I became Christ. And he has a lot to say about that later, what it means to become Christ. He says, I'm not a Christian, I became Christ. In answer to Job, many years later, in 1950s, he talks about the Christification of many. Throughout the rest of his life, he's talking, what does it mean to imitate Christ? He doesn't want to be an imitator, but if you really find your way and assume it and carry it with full responsibility, you will be living the life of Christ. You will be imitating Christ, because that's what this Jew from Nazareth did. He carried it, and he carried it to the end. And so Jung is advocating for a kind of imitation of Christ, because that's also what he experienced. And he says to his audience in 1925, you know, if I'd really believed that, I would be a ranting, raving prophet, and people would lock me up in the insane asylum. But if I didn't believe it at all, I would have gotten nothing out of the experience. So somehow you have to hold these kind of experiences in a middle ground. And in this section, in an earlier section, Jung talks about three terms: Sinn, Unsinn, and Übersinn. Sinn is meaning, meaningfulness, sense. Unsinn is nonsense, insanity, stupidity. Unsinn, es hat keinen Sinn, Unsinn, Sinn, Unsinn. And then he invents a word. This is not a word used by anybody else in the history of the German language, as far as people have been able to discover so far. But it is an echo of Nietzsche. He uses the term Übersinn, Übersinn. Nietzsche talked about Übermensch, this is Superman, the greater man, and that has been subject to interpretation and misinterpretation, what Nietzsche meant by that. But what Jung means by Übersinn is a symbolic sense, I think. I mean, it's neither literally true nor is it untrue. It's neither Sinn nor Unsinn, but somehow these combine and these are raised to another level that's called Übersinn. And so you have to hold these kind of experiences, he's saying in this text, you have to hold these kind of experiences in your consciousness as though they were real. Symbols in another sense, not mere symbols like signs or something like that, or just symbols, but as meaningful symbols that carry a meaning that can't be expressed in any other way in a better form. I better stop so we can have some questions. Why don't we take 15 minutes for questions, and then we'll have the break, okay?
So Mexico City, are you there? Can you hear us? How many people? And please ask your questions.
16.
16. Welcome.
Thank you.
Do you have a question for us today?
Yes. Do you want my question? It's about the ego, what they do. Go ahead.
Sí, sí, I'll translate the question. Murray has written a lot about individuation, transformation, active imagination.
Mi pregunta es, ¿el conocer el libro rojo transforma o cambia algo de la visión o del conocimiento que ya tiene que ha realizado?
Her question is whether Murray's knowing the Red Book changed his vision of active imagination, individuation process, whether that had any effect on his own vision.
It's a very good question. The question is, does reading the Red Book has it changed my mind about active imagination or individuation? The Red Book has surprised me in many ways by its depth, its complexity, its huge scope, and what Jung was undertaking there is something that nobody else has done. No other Jungians I know of have created another Red Book, and it's unlikely that many people ever will do it, although they will do it in their own way, I'm sure. Active imagination is something that we use in analysis for various purposes. And this is different in that Jung didn't have an analyst when he was doing this. He was completely on his own. He didn't really know what he was doing. He just plunged into it. I think he had in the back of his mind perhaps some other types of experiences with mediumship, like his cousin Helly Preiswerk was a medium, but the way I look on the Red Book is that it is the story of Jung's transformation at midlife. It's a midlife transformation process that involves a destructuring phase, letting go of what the past has been, an entry into liminality, which is very uncertain. Material appears from all sides one has to deal with, and then a restructuring phase where things are put back together again and one forms a new identity. You can find elements of all these things in the Red Book. That's the narrative story, the entry into, the passage through, and the coming out of the experience. And so Jung had this, the original experience when he was about 37, 38 years old, and he completed his work on the Red Book when he was about 50 years old, 50 or 55. So it was a long work. It's much longer than most other active imaginations, and I think he spent so much time on it because he got a lot from working with this material and thinking about it and painting it and engaging with it after the event. So if I learned something further about active imagination, it would be that element, that there are levels. You have the active imagination, but that might not be the end of the story. Maybe you can go back and add commentary to the active imagination, paint the pictures of the active imagination, extend it outward, and keep it going. So that you could say is different from what people usually do in active imagination.
What is the position of the ego in active imagination? What is the ego's position in
What is the ego's position? The ego's position, and that's what makes active imagination different from many other, let's say, forms of creating imaginative literature. The ego is the main character. The ego is central to the whole project. The ego doesn't leave its groundedness, its attitude. It might occasionally transform in some of these active imaginations that Jung has. His body has changed or something changes. There are moments when he loses his normal, let's say, everyday waking identity, but not for very long. In almost every passage, in almost all the dialogues, Jung is speaking from his everyday, rational, skeptical, ironic ego. He sometimes doesn't respect the figures, sometimes doesn't want to listen to them, argues with them, disputes with them, as he would with somebody that he were having a normal conversation with. If they say something he doesn't agree with, well, what do you mean by that? And then they challenge him back. For instance, when he first meets Philemon, Philemon won't answer his questions. Philemon just sits there, and Jung gets very frustrated. And then he starts badgering Philemon. He tries to figure out how to get Philemon, get him to give him a response. So you get that very realistic scenery where Jung is very much himself, the way he would engage with people on the street or in his garden. So the position of the ego is that it maintains all of its prejudices, all of its attitudes. It doesn't become something else. It doesn't become the other characters. In fact, there's a strong emphasis on disidentifying from the other characters. keeping a distance from the other characters. That's one of the teachings, especially in the Liber Secundus, that we'll see later, that this is an important part of individuation, to make separations, differences, draw lines. And he's very suspicious of the soul, of the anima, and of Salome. He thinks she's seductive. He thinks she's trying to trick him. She's trying to lure him into someplace he doesn't want to go, so he resists her. So the ego maintains its defenses. It's very much itself in the active imaginations.
But Buffalo, sounds like you're ready. Go ahead and ask your question, Buffalo.
Do you think perhaps Jung's vision of Europe being frozen foreshadowed the coldness of death that took place throughout Europe after this, during the war?
Yes.
Do you think this is why he was seeing Europe as being frozen? Because of the coldness?
Okay, yeah, I have your question. The question is, did Jung think that this vision of the coldness in Europe foreshadowed what would happen during the war? I think that's what Jung thought. That's why Jung felt relieved when the war broke out, actually, that it wasn't just him, that he was somehow in touch with something that was going on outside of him. Now, how to look at that? I mean, this is an interpretive question. Was it really a premonition, or was it a synchronicity? They're two different things. I've had this discussion with a friend of mine, and he thinks it's better to think of it as a synchronicity. Otherwise, it gets a little bit too magical, or forecasting future things on the basis of one's own active imagination or visions. But you can think of it either way. If it's synchronistic, it means this was happening to Jung. Okay, he was going through a crisis time, and so these visions had something to do with his crisis. They were his suffering, his bleeding from his suffering, from his wounds from Freud, or going cold in his relations to some other people internally, or and then the same thing synchronistically was going to be breaking out in Europe. So they're connected, but synchronistically rather than as a premonition, premonitorially, if there's a word like that. But Jung thought it was a premonition, and he writes about this in a number of places.
I do have an email question from Houston, Texas. I'm going to read that one, and then perhaps we'll take a break and have Murray come back. The question from Houston is really more of a comment for Murray. Jung was careful to differentiate that we can't imitate Christ. It has to be an experience, really, of our own journey that takes us to our Christ nature, without identifying with it. Murray, any comments on the question/comment from Houston?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Jung has his experiences in his active imaginations of a Christ figure, or in one case himself becoming like a Christ figure. At one point he goes into a library and checks out, in the active imagination, checks out a book, a famous text from the Middle Ages, Thomas à Kempis's book, The Imitation of Christ. So this is in his mind. It's definitely in his background. What does it mean to imitate Christ? And what he came up with finally was, what it means to imitate Christ is to follow your own journey. I mean, to take responsibility for your own life, your own beliefs, your own relationship to God, your own, and it's an individual journey, and follow it, be true to it, and follow it to the end. And he says in one lecture he gives in New York in the 1930s, if you do that, then Christ becomes your brother. You're both doing the same thing. He's carrying his cross, you're carrying your cross. That's what it means to be Christ-like, to carry the burden of your life. So I think he uses, the story of Christ, the image of Christ, as a model for the individuation process. It isn't to become a believer or accept the salvation of, or the way one typically receives Christianity. And he isn't advocating becoming a Christian, but doing what this Jew from Nazareth did 2,000 years ago, following your myth, finding out what it is, going into the wilderness, experiencing suffering, experiencing your own wisdom, and if you have to suffer on the cross, then so be it. That's what you do. And I think he kind of foresaw his own sufferings that way, or he suffers a lot in these active imaginations and in his life. I think he was a very sensitive person, and sensitive to what was going on in himself and sensitive to what was going on around him, often misunderstood or misquoted, misrepresented, and he had to accept that. He had to accept that as the cost of following his own way. Otherwise, you're just mimicking somebody else, or you're in this hero mode. You're trying to smooth the waters and make nice, and everybody will like you, and you're building a nice persona. That's absolutely not the way for Jung. The way is to be true to your inner calling, to your vocation, whatever that is. And so that's what he means by, if you will, imitating Christ, not following somebody else's way, but following your own way.
Very well, thank you very much, Murray. We're going to take a break now. We will try to open up for some more questions later after the next teaching episode. And at this point, let's turn it back to Murray in Switzerland. Murray?
Okay, so let me rush on. The Liber Primus consists of 11 chapters, and if I would summarize the message of that, it has to do with sacrifice, initiation, and transformation. Okay, that finding the soul requires sacrifice of the hero. That's the message. Following the spirit of the deep brings initiation and closeness to the soul, who is a sister, and this way changes you. Following this way changes you. So that's Liber Primus. That's a kind of introduction to the Red Book as a whole. Now, the Liber Secundus I've broken into 4 sections just so we can get a grasp of it, and I'm going to try to cover the first 3 in this portion of the seminar, and then the 4th part, and possibly the scrutinies or Prüfungen in the other one. So this Liber Secundus consists of 21 chapters, and in the first part, I'm going to cover chapters 1 through 7. And I would title this Individuation as Acceptance and Separation as the main theme. This section has a lot to do with confrontation of inner figures who present themselves autonomously and spontaneously. And this book as a whole, the Liber Secundus, Jung named Die Bilder des Irrenden, translated the images of the erring, or the ones who go astray, or the ones who are not on the normal trodden path. Die Bilder des Irrenden. It could even mean the path of the crazy ones. An Irrenhaus is an insane asylum, and at one point in this section in Liber Secundus, Jung is actually, in his fantasy, is committed to a mental hospital and diagnosed by a psychiatrist. So it's a very funny section because he knows that world very well, being one himself, of course, a psychiatrist, that is. So this first part, the first 7 chapters, let's look at quickly as individuation, as acceptance and separation. And it starts out with a quotation from Jeremiah, a diatribe against people, against prophets who preach from their own dreams and not from the Holy Scriptures, not the Word of God as it's written down in the text, in the sacred Scriptures, but who preach from their own dreams. So Jung starts out in a very ironic way, Die Bilder des Irrenden, I'm going to preach to you now preach or I'm going to prophesy from dreams, from this other personal material that has come to me, and not from the given text, the received text, the scriptures. Now, in the first chapter, he comes upon a figure called the Red One, der Rote. It's a red man, a rather impressive figure who comes from a distance, and Jung sees him coming, very graphic description of him. And he is, Jung says, neither a devil nor a Christian. He's a heathen who lives beside Christianity. He lives outside of Christianity, but he lives for the moment and he lives for pleasure. And he represents the pleasure principle, the Lustprinzip, as Freud was so fond of writing about. The Lustprinzip teaches you just live for your impulses, live for your for fun, what you want to do, what gives you pleasure in the moment. And he's very joyful. He dances through life. He's a kind of joyful figure who doesn't care very much about consequences, and the sort of Zorba the Greek-like kind of guy. And Jung has a conversation with him, again staying in the ego, and the Red One says, well, you're a stick in the mud. You must be one of those pious ones, one of those Christians, a Swiss. What are you? And they have a dialogue and a conversation, and in the end, Jung learns from him and takes something away from him. So this would represent the pleasure principle in Jung, you could say, whom he confronts and he keeps separate from, but he takes something from him at the same time. This is in individuation, this combination of acceptance of what is and taking it in somewhat, but staying separate from it. So then they have a parting of the ways. The Red One goes his way and Jung goes his way. Then Jung, in the second chapter, comes to a castle in the forest. And there he meets an old scholar, busy at his books. He asks to spend the night. He goes into a chamber. And then he's bugged by a fantasy that he can't get out of his mind. And he says, oh, it's so banal. I keep thinking that there is a beautiful daughter of this scholar in this castle waiting for me to rescue her. And he resists this stupid fantasy, and he says, oh, it's just like a romance novel or something. I hate this kind of literature. I don't want anything to do with it, but he has to accept it. So lo and behold, he looks to the door, and there she is. There she stands, and she's a pretty young girl. Her mother has died. The father is afraid to let her go out in the world, and she's a prisoner. And she tells Jung her story, and he can hardly listen to it. He's so taken back. It's so banal, so low class, lowbrow intellectual. And then she starts talking, and she's actually very intelligent, and she starts talking about the meaning of fairy tales. And she's got a lot more to her than he thought. So it's a kind of prefiguration of Mary Louise von Franz in my fantasy, that this young woman comes along and turns out to be a genius. But he does receive her. He discovers that she's intelligent, and he has to accept the ordinariness and the banality of some of his fantasies. He's just an ordinary person. He'll have ordinary fantasies walking down the street. He's as banal as anybody else. He has to accept these kinds of parts of himself, his stupidity, his banality. And, if he had to write a novel, it probably would be She Who Must Be Obeyed, Rider Haggard's type of third-class literature, of which Jung was very fond as an example of the power of the anima. Then in the third chapter, he meets another character. This one is called One of the Lowly in English, Einer der Niedrigen. And this is a one-eyed man with scars. He's been in jail, a prisoner. He got into a fight in prison. He's a lump. He's a lump, Lumpenproletariat, one of the lowest class people. And he comes to Jung, and he wants some help from Jung, and sort of a beggar on the street, a street person. And at first Jung is very put off, and then he starts feeling compassion for him, and he spends some time with him like a good Samaritan, puts him in a bed, and the man dies during the night of of his wounds, and accepting this part of himself, the ne'er-do-well, the one who can't make his way very well in the world. It's really a kind of the shadow side of the brilliant intellectual that Jung was, the man of the world. He loved to wear clothes from London and put himself forward as a kind of British gentleman. He loved to play that role. If you see pictures of him, he's always well dressed. But he knows that he has this lumpen figure in him as well, and he, in this part of the active imagination, accepts him as one of his brothers. And then he comes to, in the fourth chapter, a very interesting figure called the anchorite. And this is a man who is from the 3rd century or so, 2nd or 3rd century, lives in the Libyan desert. And he is withdrawn from life, and he's focused purely on the spiritual. This is a man of the spirit who has left the dens of iniquity of Alexandria and Cairo, whatever cities of the day, gone out into a cave, and Jung meets him out there, and he's sitting there reading the scriptures, and he's reading from the Gospel of John. He's reading, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Throughout the Red Book, there are hundreds of references to the Bible. It's full of the Bible. The Bible was in Jung's psyche. He grew up with it, of course. His grandfather was a pastor, a famous pastor in Basel. His father was a pastor, 6 uncles. He read the Bible. He studied it throughout his life. It was a very important source for him. And so when he confronts this man in the desert, he's interested. What are you reading? And then he says to him, well, it must be very boring just reading the same thing over and over again. You don't have a library around here? Where do you get some entertainment? Where do you, something else to read? You got a newspaper or, this must be very boring just reading one book. And the anchorite said, oh, you don't know about how to read. I'll tell you how to read. And what he teaches Jung is how to read deeply. I had a great teacher when I was in college, Harold Bloom. And he's written a lot of books since then, and How to Read and Why is one of his books written within the last decade or so, How to Read and Why. And he advocates exactly what this anchorite is advocating, deep reading. And deep reading is not fast reading, it's not skim reading, it's not reading when you're listening to the news or watching television or doing other things. You're by yourself, you're totally absorbed in the text, and often you say it out loud. That's deep reading. And you read it the same text many times. You memorize the text. That's deep reading. And what this anchorite is doing is reading about the Logos, about the Word that became flesh, and he's imagining it. He's bringing it, he's incarnating it. He's bringing it into his consciousness. And this takes a long time. And he says what is going on is this Logos, very abstract Greek concept of the cosmos, the order of the cosmos, logical, comes from that word. Logos was with God and was God. And this is rising out of the deep. He said it didn't descend, it didn't come from above. This is the anchorite speaking. It came from below, and it's rising, and I'm giving it birth. And I'm going to take it into the future. I'm imagining what is the future of religion. And then he tells his story, that he was an Egyptian, belonged to the Egyptian religion. They also had the story of incarnation, death, rebirth, all the same themes as Christianity. But he said, when I heard about Jesus and the Christian story, it was more convincing to me, because there actually, it did incarnate in a man. The Word became flesh. I'm fascinated by that idea, that the Word, Logos, can become flesh, can take on meat and bone and blood. That's very convincing to me. So I became a Christian. And I'm wondering what the next stage of religion will be. Where's it going from here? So I sit here and read about the Logos, and I'm imagining what religion will be like in 1,000 years or 2,000 years. And this idea that there are stages in the development of religion is a very important idea to Jung. comes up again later on in the Red Book, where he realizes that it will take 800 years for the next form of religion to be born. And so this monk, this anchorite's name is Ammonius, and he represents pure spirit, incarnating the spiritual, bringing it into this world. But he is the contrast, the opposite of the red one, of the red man. And so they will get together a little later and do something that's very interesting. And Jung takes his leave from Ammonius, having learned about deep reading and wondering what the next religion will be. And then he comes in chapter 6, he goes to the north, and he comes upon a gray figure, and he looks at a gaunt gray figure, and he looks at him, and he says, "Blood has never circulated in this man's body. This man has no heart, and it's death. He has come to the land of death." And death is standing at the border, on the seashore, at the border of land and water, just standing there, doing nothing but waiting. And as Jung stands there and waits with death, and he gets this cold feeling, here's the coldness that he had in those visions. It's death. And he looks up the hill, and rolling down the hill is a huge ball of material, trees, vegetative material, animals, human bodies, all the harvest of the summer, the end of the summer, rolling down the hill into the sea, where it will be lost in the collective unconscious, rolling down into death. So this vision of death and the summer's dead rolling down the hill gives Jung this very special feeling of being close to the reality of death. And he says the acceptance of death. Again, the theme is acceptance here. The acceptance of death and this vision of death, he says, brings or increases the joy of living. If you live close to death, or you've had the experience of coming close to death, and some of you in the audience I'm sure have, you've been very ill, or you've practically died, or have died and come back, and you have this experience of the nearness of death, you probably know that this makes life all the more precious. Jung said being close to death increased his joy of living. And then in chapter 7, the end of this section, he goes into a place called the remains of earlier temples, the Reste Friere Temple, and there he finds Ammonius and the red man together. And they've been traveling together. Now these two figures from the unconscious, the one representing the Lustprinzip, the principle of pleasure, and the other one representing pure spirituality, have been brought together in this active imagination. And they've been traveling together. And as they travel together, there's a story that the anchorite is changed importantly. The red one, the red man, takes him into the brothels and into the nightclubs and into the bars, and really shows him a spectacular world of pleasure and dissipation, and himself gets tired of it. And in the process, they moderate or modify each other. The red man takes on some of the anchorite's qualities, the anchorite takes on some of the red man's qualities. And Jung would say later in his writings about active imagination, not only is the ego changed through this engagement with the figures of the unconscious, but the figures of the unconscious are also changed. And so there's a kind of dialectical interplay between ego consciousness and the figures of the unconscious. And then this is an example of how the unconscious figures themselves, unbeknownst to the ego, while Jung's ego is doing something else, do a dance with each other and balance each other out. And the end of this section, Jung comes to the conclusion that the important thing is to find the middle. And this is another important theme throughout the Red Book, finding the middle way. The way is a middle way that combines the opposites or holds the opposites in tension. It doesn't split. It doesn't choose one over the other. It holds the tension of the opposites and the polarities. And in holding this tension, It doesn't identify either with the ideals, the spiritual ideals on the one side, or with the instinctual infrared end of the spectrum, as he writes about it later, the instinctual side of the psyche on the other. It holds an in-between ground. And he says it's important to stay separate from both of them, from all of these figures, in order to maintain balance and to find the middle way. So it's a story of discovery, acceptance, but also not identifying with them, maintaining separateness, maintaining distance. So the message of this section of the Liber Secundus is confrontation with inner figures who represent basic attitudes toward life, leads both to acceptance of what they stand for and represent, partially, and also to separation from them, so you're not identified with them. You know where they are, what they when they're at work. And individuation proceeds by stages toward a distinct and individual sense of balancing these opposites, the various factors of the psyche, that without identifying with any of them. So that's a very important conclusion that Jung reaches in this first part, let's say, of the Liber Secundus. In the second part, and I'll have to go a little faster, I've titled that, this is basically chapters 8 through 13, individuation as integration. The first part was more separation. Now he's going to start integrating some important things. And you could also refer to this section as a holy illness and the constellation or the birth of the wounded healer. Because Jung has to accept his holy illness, his craziness, if you will, his own psychic reality. Well, on the first day, it says Erster Tag, this is the 8th of January 1914, chapter 8. Jung is traveling to the east. He traveled to the north where he met death. Now he's going to the east. And as he goes to the east, he comes upon a figure, a mythological figure, named Izdubar. Izdubar the Mighty. And he paints a picture of him. It's his first big picture in the Red Book, and I just want to show it to you quickly. It's on page 37, I believe. I don't care much for the picture, but it's quite an impressive figure. He's a giant of a figure, Izdubar the Mighty. There you see him. Can you all see him? It's on page 37 of the Red Book. And Izdubar comes from the east. He's a figure of the east. And Sonu Shamdasani writes something in a footnote about him that he's related to Gilgamesh and so on. But he's a mythological figure. And he's wounded. He comes from the land of faith and belief, and he's been wounded by reports that he's gotten that in the West, and he wants to go to the West, in the West there's a very different attitude toward religion and faith, very skeptical, very scientific. And Jung comes from the West to the East, and they confront each other. Izdubar represents the mythological man, mythological attitude, early sort of pre-Enlightenment, pre-Christian even, or Eastern religions. People who to this day go to India, they say it's a very spiritual place. It's so different from the West, from Europe or North America. And he comes from the East, he comes from the Middle East, comes this way, and they meet. And Jung wants to go to the East, and Izdubar says, don't go to the East, it will blind you. The sun's too bright for you there. So he warns Jung not to go to the East. And Jung is sorry for him because he's been wounded by science. He says, in the West, we no longer have faith. We no longer have religion. God is dead. Nietzsche announced it years ago. And what we have now is science. And science wounds religion. If you come to the West, it will destroy you. They'll take you apart. They will analyze you to pieces. They will reduce you to rubble. You can't go to the West. And so they're stuck there. And Izdubar is wounded. Jung feels sorry for him, but he's too big to pick up. What's he going to do with him? How can he heal him? That becomes the problem and the question. So Jung comes upon an ingenious idea. He says, I'm going to treat Izdubar as a fantasy. I'm going to say he's just a fantasy, and I can take this big figure, and I'm going to put him in a tiny shell, in an eggshell, put put them in my pocket, and go back home. Go back to the West. And as long as I've got them in my pocket, nobody will see him. They can't attack him. And I'll just carry this mythological attitude home and hold it secretly. And that will offer it protection. And then while it's there, I will try to heal it. So he does that. He puts him in an egg, goes home with him, and then when he gets home, having made religion a private affair, hidden it away in his pocket, this is the solution. This is how you can be religious in the atheistic, scientific, Enlightenment West. You can be secretly religious. Keep it in your pocket. Don't tell anybody about it. And so when he gets home with it, he realizes it still isn't healed. It's in the egg, and he has to breathe life into it. He has to bring it back to life. So there's this section called the incantations, which is inserted later, where he does these prayers and incantations to bring Izdubar back, to heal him, bringing back to life. And here you see Jung, the spiritual healer, at work, breathing life into this figure Izdubar. And he's successful. He's immensely successful. He opens the egg in chapter 11, Die Eröffnung des Eis, and Izdubar comes out of the egg healed and well, like a reborn son, and he rises up, and he returns to where he came from, to the east, where the sun rises. So he's the healed mythological man, but he leaves Jung behind, and now there's a separation again. Jung realized that he couldn't go to the East for religion. He writes about this later. He says it's a mistake to try to mimic Eastern religions. We have to stay true to our own history, to our own path. That's not the way for us. It certainly wasn't for him, although he learned a lot about Eastern religions, and he even traveled to India and so on. But he was not in favor of leaving your own tradition, whatever that is. And in the West, it's Christianity, Judaism, whatever your tradition happens to be, but rather to go with it, to try to elaborate or carry it further, but not to leave it behind or go after something else and try to mimic the people of the East. So Izdubar retreats, and Jung realized he can't regress to being a mythological person, taking on mythological meanings and living in a phony mythology wouldn't work. He was too honest. He was scientific. He was an Enlightenment man. He had a statue of Voltaire in his study, the arch Enlightenment figure, for another reason, which I'll tell you a little later. But so mythological man, heal it and leave it be. He goes off. He goes back, and now Jung finds himself in hell, in a very gloomy vault, because mythology doesn't work for him. That kind of religious attitude has to be left aside. He separates from it, and he goes into probably the darkest, grimmest scenes of the whole Red Book. Horrible, horrible imagery. He goes into a place, it's called Hell, die Hölle, where he sees a mistreated girl with golden hair, an abused girl with golden hair, lying under the body of a man, and she has a fishhook in his eye. And he represents evil. He is evil. He's a child abuser, something like that, or a devilish figure. This is hell, after all. And in hell, this abused young girl with a fishhook in his eye. And she holds it in his eye because he cannot let go of his eye. He cannot let go of his sight, or he will be lost. So she's got him by the short hairs. And he can't further abuse her, but she can't release herself either. And there they are in this stalemate. Then, in the next chapter, chapter 13, which is the end of this section, the conclusion of it, is a truly grisly, horrifying. I could hardly read this. I wanted to put the book down, and there are passages like this in there. And I'm sure Jung felt his stomach turning as he was going through these. These are the dark night of the soul type places. He goes into a place, chapter 13, called the sacrificial murder, die Opfermord. Snakes coiling and hanging from branches, dismembered bloody body of a little girl lying there. And his soul comes to him. Now, this is his soul figure. This is a mature woman, not the little girl. This is a soul. And his soul says he has to eat a piece of the little girl's liver. Ghastly, he gags, he refuses, he wants to run away. But the soul insists you have to do that. You have to eat a piece of her liver. So he chokes it down. And when he does, you have this sudden passage of reflection, commentary, that he's taken back the projection of God out there. He no longer projects God out there. Now God has come into his soul. Somehow eating this liver, and I don't fully understand it, I'm still studying this book, of course, but eating this, going through this grisly moment of initiation, and many initiations are horrible. This seems to be the darkest point of the whole thing, in my view. Going through this initiation has changed his attitude toward where does God live? He no longer lives out there. He's no longer projected as in mythology. God lives on the mountains, or he lives in a heavenly palace or something, or behind the clouds. He brings God back home to the soul. So God is coming into the soul, and from this eating of he calls it the divine child, eating the divine child, integrating the divine, sacrificed, he receives what he calls a divine illness. And this is what I think of as the gift, if you will, of the wounded healer, that there is, he says in another place, to live with God is to attack reason. It is an attack on our integrity. It is an illness that has to be cured, and we can't cure it. To be close to God is an illness. That's the way he thinks about it. Because it's so powerful, and the energies are so problematic on one side, and difficult. And in other reflection, he says, people who try to live close to God are all destroyed. It destroys them, it blinds them, it cripples them. They can't manage it, with one exception, Christ. This Jew from Nazareth managed it. Somehow could live with God deeply and not be destroyed by it, but live it through and live it out. And another reason why Christ is important to Jung is that he was able to do the great work that Jung is himself setting out to do, to be close to the self, or to the divine that is behind the self or beyond the self, but reflected in the self. To get close to the source of energy and not be destroyed by it is a gargantuan undertaking, and a very dangerous one. So the wounded healer is created and made conscious in him, and he finds a way to move toward spirituality within modernity, having rejected the mythological, going back through the hell of modernity, coming upon this opportunity to integrate the divine child through this horrible act of initiation. He is finding his way into what will be his path. This is the way that he's looking for. And I'm going to stop here because I do want to leave time for questions and discussion.
Actually, let's try Asheville. I know there's a question here, and there was a hand that went up in the corner. Is that still a question, or want to pass?
Going back to your initial comments, historical context, basically this work in historical context, I guess I think in terms of the break with Freud, Jung's relationship with other women, withdrawal from public life, but also this revolver that sits beside his bedside at night. And I'm curious, you get into some of this, I think, in the second part of the lecture. I'm curious, at what points do you see this as a dialogue of one man's struggle for survival and specifically points of contact with pain and pathos.
So, to what extent is this one man's struggle for survival in the face of enormous pain and pathos? Well, it certainly is that. I think he was struggling to survive psychically. I mean, that revolver in his drawer was partly there to, he was a psychiatrist and he worried about patients attacking him, finding out where he lived and maybe coming to get him. At least that's a reason he gives. Also, in the Swiss army, everybody, all men in Switzerland had to be in the military, and they all were issued weapons. And so the revolver was a military revolver that he kept there. But there is one passage where he says he felt that if he couldn't understand a dream, he would have to kill himself. And I don't know how serious he was about that, but it certainly put a lot of energy into that interpretation that he did finally come up with. But survival, I would say, more on a psychic level. I think when he left Freud, he could have decided, in thinking about the timing of all this, he could have decided to take over the international psychoanalytic movement. He actually had the majority of members in the IPA with him when they met in Munich and there was an election for the president. 22 out of, 60 or so members withheld their vote. Those were the Freud people from Vienna. The rest voted for Jung. And then he faced the question, does he want to have a big fight? I mean, he'd have to more or less kill Freud off, grab the crown for himself, and take it in a heroic way out into the world. And he decided not to do that, I think for a couple of reasons. I don't think he wanted to kill Freud. I think he, in a way, admired him, and he just thought, we're different. He'll go his way, I'll go my way. But the other reason is that he really saw a kind of psychic death for him if he continued on that road, because his soul wasn't on that road. And so this search for his soul that is right at the beginning of the Red Book, recovery of the soul, is to find something that he'd lost, who knows when, somewhere in his childhood or in his youth when, he'd gotten busy with so many other things, including family and practice, his professional life and his intellectual life and all of that. He had to get back to himself. And so it's a struggle for survival in that sense, for psychic survival. If you don't live out of yourself or get a hold of yourself, you're among the living dead. And that's what he would have become. Pure persona, just walking through life, maybe very successfully. He was very clever, very charming. If he'd been a psychopath, he could have made his way beautifully and become famous and everything else. But he knew that was not for him. And here at midlife, that's a midlife crisis, he made the choice to really search out his own way. And so you put your finger on, with the word survival, I think the urgency of it. This book contains a lot of urgency. It's not a lot of fun to read. And he's struggling and suffering, but there's a reason behind it, and that is precisely to save his soul. SOS, save our soul.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, Murray. I'm interested especially in the emerging God image, not only in Jung's individual journey and the transformation of Jung's image of God, but beyond that, to the emerging God image, especially in the West. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Mm-hmm.
You still hear me? Yeah,
Yeah.
Murray, I can hear you barely.
Yeah. I can hear you fine.
So,
Yep.
Okay, good. So my question is, where do you see the spirit of the depths breaking into the spirit of the times? I'm looking for a word of hope. I know it's going to take 800 years, but if you see any glimmers of hope of the emerging God image, I'd like to hear your response.
That is really such a major question. I wrote a little pamphlet. The Guild of Pastoral Psychology has a conference every year, and some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I wrote three-essay pamphlet, three-part pamphlet on the emerging God image, and I used a couple of dreams from patients of mine that indicated something about that, and I find that subject so massive and difficult to get into. I can't really say very much about it. I think it has to do with integration of what has been left out, and whether you see that as the feminine or the earth or the evil, or picking that up and bringing it into an image that is more comprehensive, let's say, than what we have experienced for the last 1,500 years or so. So I can't offer a picture of it, or in the Prüfungen, Jung comes up with this idea of a Praxis, and the sermons, the 7 sermons to the dead, which I don't find very convincing. Nor did the dead who are being preached to. But it is an image of inclusiveness. So something about including the feminine and including the dark side, and people are talking about the Gaia principle, that maybe something about nature and the earth that's been more or less repressed, or somewhat at least repressed in Christianity especially, needs to come in with more, let's say, more authenticity in a fuller way than has been the case. Something along those lines. I don't know if that offers you very much hope. I think people are really working on the question, at least here in Zurich. There are people working on it in their own ways, and I think it has to do inevitably with more wholeness, more completeness, more integration, and something a little less damaging or one-sided than we have had for various reasons in the past. That's about all I can say about that, I think.
Evanston, this is Evanston.
Evanston, okay, go ahead, Evanston. And everybody turn down your speakers and mute your microphones if you're not talking. Go ahead, Evanston.
Evanston, Illinois, and we have 18 people here.
Right.
And the question is with regard to participation, active participation, as opposed to the word imagination. No. Okay.
Active participation. Well, I think that's an alternative. It is a matter of active participation in the fantasies that the ego.
Okay, there's a question I have.
Everybody go ahead and remute your microphones, and we'll let Murray answer that question, and then we'll go into teaching. So mute all the microphones if you could, and go ahead, Murray.
So Evanston offered the phrase active participation, as opposed to active imagination. Okay. I don't know that one. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Mary.
Somebody's breaking in.
The whole idea of participation vis-a-vis imagination.
Yes.
And the question really has to do with, isn't active participation a word that is more indicative of what happened in the Red Book vis-a-vis active imagination? I know Jung used that word, but it's different.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead, Murray. And
Okay.
everybody else hold questions for now.
As far as I know, you've just come up with a new phrase, active participation. I like it. I think it's very descriptive of what's going on in these dialogues, that Jung is actively participating with these figures, participating in a drama. And so, it might even be preferable. You ought to write that up and offer it to the Jungian public. I think it's a good idea. That's the point I was making about active in whatever you call it, that the ego is actively present and it is participating. So are the other figures participating. I mean, there is really a dialogue that goes on. They talk back, he talks back. They have their own names. They offer their names. So it's a very vivid type of imagination that's going on in which all sides are participating. And there's quite a lot of noise in there sometimes, a lot of activity going on. You could say that Jung had a very active imagination himself. I mean, he had a very vivid imagination which he could personify these figures, these inner figures, and you can't say that he gives them life. They have life. They present themselves to him, and then he participates in the drama that unfolds, and he does not reject even the most humiliating and the most disgusting invitations to participate. So I think he realizes that if he turns away, he isn't going to find his way. And with that, I'm going to have to get going here so that I can give you a kind of conclusion. I'm going to have to skip over a bunch of material, but you have the book, you can read it, just to say what is the final result of all this. And so I want to go into the last part of the last chapter, chapter 21 of the Liber Secundus, which is the end of the Red Book itself. Then a Liber Tertius, if you will, a third book, was added by Sonu Shamdasani when they put together this volume, and that is the what they're calling the scrutinies, or the Prüfungen. And that is also a part of the Black Books, but Jung created a separate manuscript of that and broke out from that section the 7 Sermons to the Dead and published those separately. But now it's brought back, and it really does belong. It's integral to the whole of the story that unfolds in the Red Book. But I'm going to more or less stop with the end of the Liber Secundus for today. And maybe another time we can go in. It would be a whole seminar in itself, the chapter on Prüfungen, because that's where the 7 sermons are, and there's a lot of material in there. But toward the end of, or in the last chapter of the Liber Secundus, chapter 21, we meet Philemon for the first time in the book. The chapter is titled Der Zauberer, the magician. And this takes place in January and February of 1914. And this is just before then Jung goes ahead and resigns his various positions. So it's really a very powerful conclusion. It goes on until the 19th of April, this section. It's the longest single chapter in the book, The Magician. And here Jung says it's his 10th adventure, if you count these various episodes as adventures. And he goes in search of a magician because he knows he has to find a magician to what he calls steer the wagon. He asks himself at the end of chapter 20, who's going to steer the wagon on this way? Who guides the way? And he concludes that the ego can't do it properly, that reason and intention by themselves will not create a future. They only repeat the past. If you only use reason and intention, you use your experience, and nothing new will come of it. What produces the creative is something that breaks in, something that is different, that's off the wall, that interrupts and upsets. And reason and intention by themselves don't do that. They repeat the past. And so to find this way, which is a new way, this is a new book, the new way, creative way, he has to find another guide. He has to find another means of steering the wagon. So he decides to go in search of a magician, the great magician for instruction. And now we come upon the concept of magic and magician. So going in search of the magician, he goes to the home of Philemon and Baucis. Now, Philemon and Baucis are a couple, a pair. They're living in this home. They're in retirement. They're old. They're classical figures. They're from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Philemon and Baucis were the couple that welcomed the gods, Apollo and Zeus, or Hermes and Zeus, who were traveling through the world. They came into their home. They offered them their best food and so on, and the gods blessed them for this welcome reception. Receiving the gods becomes absolutely critical in Jung's philosophy and his attitude toward life. In the end, he says the ego must be cleansed and turned into a receptacle, into a clean receptacle, into a vessel. The ego is not there for taking charge and taking action. It's there to receive. It should be a vessel. So he wants to receive something from another source and goes to Philemon and Baucis, who are the ones who have received the gods. That's why he goes to them. And he tries to get into a conversation with Philemon in order to teach him magic. And Philemon resists him. Philemon is tending his tulips. He's not interested in dialoguing with Jung. He's retired from the world, and he's just tending his own garden. And this image of tending your own garden, just taking care of your own business, tending your soul, loving your soul deeply, taking good care of your soul, becomes sort of the hallmark of this way. Okay, the way is to tend your own business, tend your soul, care for your soul, love your soul. And Philemon is a model of that. He's just there in his own house. He's taking care of his tulips. He's meditating, taking care of himself, of his soul. And he keeps to himself. He doesn't teach. He's not wise. He's wise only for himself, but like a serpent, stays to himself. And he's not a Christian. In other words, he doesn't belong to the community of people who are doing good and helping. This is a very different attitude of going inward and living a solitary life, tending your own garden. Now, we know that Jung kept a bust of Voltaire in his study throughout his life, in his home in Küsnacht. And I'd often wondered about that, because Voltaire is so different. His attitude is so different from Jung. He's a man of the Enlightenment, very rational, French, and so on, French intellectual. Jung was not at all inclined in that direction. But what he liked about Voltaire was Candide. And at the end of Candide, where Candide comes home, finally decides the way to live is to tend your own garden, to stay at home and be deeply connected to yourself. And that's the way Jung lived the rest of his life. He did travel. He traveled quite a bit, actually. But he built himself a house at Bollingen. He spent a lot of time in solitude. And he did his active imaginations and meditations and worked on things like the Red Book. And so this is the message that Philemon will teach him by example. He teaches him by example. And he doesn't give him many words. In the end, Philemon says, what is magic? It's just it's a way of dealing with the irrational. It tries to make the irrational intelligible. It's receiving the irrational into your home, welcoming it, engaging it, participating with it. And if you do that, it has an effect on you, and indirectly it will then have an effect on other people. That's magic. That's what magic is. That's all it is. It isn't some great power that you're going to get in your hand, like a wand that you can transform lead into gold. It's how to be comfortable with the irrational and to make it intelligible. That's what magic is. And this is going to be Jung's great gift from the soul. She's going to give him the wand of magic that opens the door to the unconscious and invites it in. So this is the only appearance of Philemon in the Red Book itself. It's a minor appearance, very important, but in terms of space, very small space is given to Philemon. He then comes back in the scrutinies as a major figure and becomes the great teacher of the 7 sermons and so on. But then Jung is now coming to a conclusion, and at this conclusion, the Kabiroi appear. The Kabiroi are spirits of the deep. They live under the earth. They're like blacksmiths and metallurgists. They belong to the Great Mother Earth. They're the creativity in the earth, forces of the deep unconscious. And they come up out of the depths, and they bring with them the material to build a castle for Jung. They build him a tower, and this tower is impregnable. This tower sits on solid ground. Jung says this tower is not made of words and books and concepts and ideas. It's made out of blood and guts. It comes from the depths, and it's something you can really rely on. So they're building a structure for him. And this is a structure that he will live in for the rest of his life. This is what we call building the transcendent function in Jungian psychology later. And you should realize that Jung wrote his essay, The Transcendent Function, in the midst of all this, 1915, 1916. He wrote The Transcendent Function, an essay of about 20 or 30 pages, in which he describes very carefully the building up of this inner structure through active imagination. He then put it in his drawer, like he put away the Red Book. And that came out of his drawer in the 1950s. Students at the Jung Institute somehow discovered it and brought it into the light of day, published it, and it's in the collected works now in volume 8, I think, The Transcendent Function. You go and read it. It's a very good description of what he's doing at this time and building up this structure from below, that the Kabiroi bring up the materials to make this structure. And it's impregnable, and he can withdraw into it, and it's a place to be solitary. The big problem with it is that it goes in the direction of isolation. And he worries deeply about this. He says, does this way that I'm discovering, this way of solitude, mean that I have nothing to do with other people? Is it so isolated? Is it so apart from the community that I'm going to go into a sort of solipsistic or schizoid place and live in my little tower and be protected? Yes, but I'm out of contact. So he worries about the problem of love. And he hears Salome weeping. His soul is weeping at what is happening because he's going too far in this direction of the tower. He's cutting himself off too much. Yes, it's important to have this structure, but if you're cut off from other people, you have no empathy, you have no connection with them, you can't live a human life that way. And certainly out of contact with human beings, it's a tremendous loss of what they have to offer and what they have to contribute to you and you to them. So that's a big worry on his part. And Salome crying insists on entering into his life, and he rejects her. Elijah and Salome come back. Elijah offers her to him as his reward, and he says, listen, I can't have another woman in my life. I'm already married, and I don't live in Turkey. He says, I can't have a bunch of wives. There's a lot of humor in the Red Book. And so he rejects her at first, but she doesn't let go. She keeps coming back. And then he realizes that he has to accept a kind of transformed love into his life, a different kind of love from the seductiveness that Salome originally represented. Salome is not a good image of the anima. She's nasty, she's seductive, she is responsible for the death of John the Baptist, bring his head to me on a platter. She's into power. She's a horrible image of the feminine, you could say, and he's put off by her and appalled that she's the one that would appear to him. So she has to be transformed. That's part of her being cured of her blindness. And he says the lust has to be taken out of her, and I have to take that on myself and leave something called pure love to her. And then he has to have a long meditation. What is that? What is real love? And so this is as he comes to the end of the Red Book, a book of passion, incidentally, a book of feeling, and full of his blood and guts, he has this long meditation on love. And at a certain moment, the serpent, who has become a very important figure to him, a few chapters back, he and the serpent really get united, and he depends on the serpent for grounding in his instinctual life and integration of the shadow, very important moment in his individuation process. The serpent now comes to him and turns into a bird. And the bird and the serpent, of course, are a pair of opposites. The bird represents the spirit and the serpent the instinct. But they're so connected now. They're so in relation to each other, spirit and matter and spirit and body, that one can turn into the other. And the serpent flies to the heavens, disappears, and comes as the bird, and then comes back and says that the bird has found something for him in heaven. Serpent, bird comes back and says, I've found something for you up there in heaven, in the heavenly places, a crown. Well, this is very symbolic, of course, in Christianity, the crown of thorns of Christ, but the crown of righteousness, the crown of glory, all of this. I found a crown for you, and I bring you this crown back. And now it is in, and the text of the Red Book stops. That's where Jung stops writing his calligraphy. So if you just had the Red Book, that would be the end. You wouldn't know what happens now. But in the black books, it goes on. And so in the translation, they keep the text going. What she says, or what the bird says, and now it is in my hands a golden kingly crown. Inside is writing. Inscribed inside the crown is writing. And it's a quotation from 1 Corinthians 13. Love never ends. That's the famous love passage of St. Paul, where faith, hope, and charity, or faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. And so inside this crown that Jung gets for all his efforts, you could say, is the probably most important teaching of his Christian faith and background. Love never ends. And this is something that he wonders about. He says, what am I going to do with this? How am I to understand this? What does this mean? So he accepts the crown, and then he finds himself hanging on a tree, high up in a tree, in the crown of a tree. And he can't cut himself down from the tree, and he realizes he has to stay hung in this tree until he understands the meaning of this crown and its message. And so he meditates on it for 3 days and 3 nights. The soul can't cut him down. She can't get up there high enough to cut him down. He's tempted to come down by Satan and the red man. Come down on the ground, all that spiritual nonsense. Get your feet back on the earth. Live a normal life, life of pleasure in the concrete world. He won't go there. He won't give up. He hangs there for 3 days. And finally, the bird comes to him. And the bird says to him, just fly. Just use your arms and fly, and you can be released. And when he does that, the soul, Salome, standing on the ground, also develops wings. And she can fly, and he brings his feet back to the ground. And this is the spiritualization of, you could say, lust for Jung. That's what love means, that it's agape, it's real caring. It's not using other people for your own lustful purposes, or seducing them, or using them for power reasons, the way Salome did in the situation with King Herod and John the Baptist. And then there comes, I think, a wonderful climax of the whole thing where the snake tells Jung a fairy tale. And to my knowledge, this is an original fairy tale. I don't know that it's written in any books anywhere. And it's the story of a king who isn't able to have a son. And so he and his wife despair of ever having a son to take over his position. And he gets the idea to go into the woods and consult with a wise old woman in the woods, a witch. And he goes and does that, and the witch tells him, well, take some of this kind of special material, put it in a pot, and bury it in the woods for 9 months. Come back and see what's in the pot. So he does it, and he comes back, and 9 months later, opens it up, and there's a beautiful baby boy in the pot. Takes it home, his wife, breasts full of milk, feeds the baby, they raise the child, grows very strong, very bright, very gifted boy, and shows great promise. And when the boy is 18 years old, he comes to his father and he says, I'm ready now, give me the crown. I want to take over. And the father is very threatened by this. The father says, I'm not ready to give it up yet. And the boy says, but I'm ready to take it. I'm 18 years old, I'm strong, I'm ready to go. Give me the crown, give me the kingdom. It's my due. And so the king decides he can't handle this, and he thinks about solutions, doesn't come up with anything, and decides finally he's going to have to kill the boy. He's going to have to kill his son. So he goes to the witch and he asks her, how can I kill him? What can I do? I want to get rid of him. This isn't working out. And the witch says, well, take the pot, put this material in it, bury it in the woods for 9 months, see what happens. And he does that, and in those 9 months, the boy loses his strength, gets very weak, gets sick, and finally at the end of 9 months dies. So the king has a solution. He's the king again, doesn't have to worry about him, but he misses him terribly, and he realizes he made a dreadful mistake, that he should have really turned over the kingdom to him. He has no heir now, he has no son. What can he do? So he goes back to the witch again, and he asks her, what can I do now? I've made a terrible mistake. I really missed the boy. He showed great promise. She said, well, take this material, put it in the pot, bury it 9 months, see what happens. Does it again. Goes back in 9 months. There's the baby boy again. He takes him out, and this time the baby boy grows to 18 in a very short time, in a few months, or a few years, 3 or 4 years. He's 18. He comes to his father again and says, give me the crown. I'm ready now. This time the father gives it to him. And he turns out to be a very wonderful and successful king. And he takes very good care of his father and his mother. And that's the fairy tale. Now, Jung is told this fairy tale by the snake because it's a message that what you have given birth to in this whole process has no father and no mother. It comes out of the depths. It comes out of the earth. It's the product of magic, if you will. The magic woman in the woods has given birth to this. The womb of the earth, the unconscious, has brought this into being. And the day is going to come where you have to turn leadership over to this boy. And you have to let go. The ego has to let go. And what that means is turning your life over to the spiritus rector, to the self, to what has come out of you, to the transcendent function, and giving up ego control for direction and choice, and allowing yourself to experience life in a very different way. And so that's the end of the, basically the end of the story of the Liber Secundus. At that point, Jung says, I close the bronze doors and come to myself. A mountain covers over this opening. The water flows over it. It disappears. And I am returned to my own self, my I. And he's rather disgusted. I'm barbaric, he says. I need to be refined. I don't like I'm very unconvincing. I'm a pitiful figure. I need to work on myself more. But now I need to work on the I. And it needs to become a vessel and a womb of life. That's what the ego needs to become. That's what he gets into in the Prüfungen, in the testing, where he really challenges his ego and tries to open himself up and turn himself into a vessel, turn his ego into a vessel or a womb. Very feminine image. Masculine ego turning into a womb. Imagine that. Jung, the great leader, the great hero, first president of the IPA, Freud's crown prince, turning into a womb. And then the final sentence, he says, the proof, and he uses a German word, Prüfstein, the stone that is used to test metals, a testing stone, where you push the metal across the stone. If it leaves a mark, it means it's genuine, it's real gold. The Prüfstein, testing the metal, the proof is being alone with oneself. This is the way. And so it's really the way of the solitary. It's the way of tending the soul as an individual, living the life of a solitary, not out of relationship, but in deep connection to the soul and to the inner world, and letting a lot of the other stuff go. So that really was Jung's great discovery through all this. He found his way. It was the way of the individual. It was the way of the solitary, the way of depth, listening to the deep, ego turning into a vessel rather than an instrument or a sword or a thrusting heroic tool, becoming a womb.
Email question, Murray. Had the Red Book been written 1,000 years ago, to what degree might it have been taken as a God-inspired sacred scripture, and how would it thus be viewed today, 1,000 years later?
Well, the question is, had it been written 1,000 years ago and discovered, would it be taken as a God-inspired scripture? Possibly, but it couldn't have been written 1,000 years ago because, well, I suppose anything's possible. It's unlikely that there would have been anybody around 1,000 years ago that would have engaged his imagination in this particular way. Now, Jung wrote this book or created this Red Book to look like an old book. You know, when you look at the pages, many people have said it looks like a medieval manuscript. You know, illuminated pages, not so much the paintings, but the pages, the calligraphy. It could come out of a medieval monastery library. And I think, why did Jung, I ask myself, why did Jung create this particular form? Could have chosen, options are many, could have chosen many forms. Why put it into this kind of script? Except that he wanted it for himself, perhaps, and if anybody else read it, to read as a kind of sacred text, a kind of God-inspired text. He has to be given credit for actually making it. This did not just arise out of nothing. The fantasies and the images came to him, but he had to write them down, and he had to put the book together, and he had to make it in a particular style. And what this style does is give it the quality of a kind of sacred book. I mean, you wouldn't write in the margins of it or underline things. When they decided to publish the Red Book, I was told by Ulrich Herne, there were many discussions about how to do it, what form to give it. And originally they thought it would be in a book about this size, you know, a normal size book, something like the Collected Works with some nice color pictures in it, but basically a book like any other. And when W.W. Norton started discussing the project with them, they decided for what is called the maximal solution, really to go all out and produce a facsimile version of the book and create a book that has the feeling and the weight and the seriousness, you could say the gravitas, of the Red Book itself. In fact, even some deluxe editions, I don't know, a couple hundred deluxe editions of this were produced at great, I think you had to pay a couple $1,000s for them. But it's the same inside content, which is of exquisite quality. One of the best printers in the world, an Italian printer, was commissioned to do the printing. They spent an enormous amount of time and energy photographing the pages of the Red Book to make this wonderful edition. And so it's a bargain in this version, $100, $150. You get a jewel of a book, very precious. If you bought the deluxe edition for a couple $1,000, you get the same book, but with a leather cover. So there was some disappointment in the deluxe version. I don't know, it was a gimmick on the part of the publishers to raise some extra funds or something, I don't know. But it would be nice to have a leather cover on this, not at that cost maybe. But everything goes together to give this book that feeling that you mentioned, a God-inspired text. It all goes in that direction. And it's a book I imagine people will buy and keep in their libraries and pass on to the next generation. I have an extra copy that I won't even open in my lifetime. I'm just going to keep it pristine for my children and my grandchildren and pass it on. So it comes with that feeling tone to it. It's a kind of very unusual event in the publishing world to produce something like this. And it's wildly successful. When they published it, they only printed 5,000 copies in the first printing run. And it was sold out long before it ever got to the bookstores. They did another 5,000. They're up to about 30,000 now in English. And in German, it sold out its first 5,000 copies, and they're into a second printing there. So it's very attractive. Why people are buying it in such large numbers, I'm not sure, but it has a real draw to it. You want something like that, and it's not priced so out of sight that you can't afford that, and so it's a very special object. It's an art object.
Go from there. This is from Seattle, and the question from Seattle is, isn't the way, as Dr. Stein described it, an Eastern concept, e.g. Taoism? So didn't Jung then really rediscover an Eastern method rather than avoiding it with Izdubar?
That's a good question, yeah. His relationship to China and Chinese philosophy and Taoism and so on is a very, I would say, a very important part of his whole repertoire. He read the I Ching early on in an early translation, and then when Richard Wilhelm translated it into German, he knew Richard Wilhelm. They became friends, so he studied the what was available of in German translation of Chinese literature, and then very importantly, in 1928, I think it was, Richard Wilhelm sent him a packet of materials, including a Chinese text called The Secret of the Golden Flower that he had translated into German, and asked Jung to write a commentary, and inserted into that, in part of the material, there were some pictures, some images, and mandalas. And Jung had just finished painting this image, this mandala. It's the last picture insertion into his book, this one. And he said he was astonished. When he was doing it, he said it had a kind of Chinese feeling to it. It felt like, it looks Chinese. And then he got this material from Richard Wilhelm synchronistically, and he even writes at the bottom of this book, 1928, when I got the material from Richard Wilhelm to write the commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower. This was so striking to him, and that put him off in a whole new direction into the study of alchemy, because it was a Chinese alchemical text, and so that's another story. But this idea of the way, the Tao, of course, is in his commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower. That's a bit later. His studies of Chinese philosophy and Taoism, religion, and so on really came after the primary experiences, if you will, that are the foundation of the Red Book, that 1913-1914 period of about 3 or 4 months, where he's looking for his soul, he's trying to find the way. But the way is also a Western idea, the way of in the way of truth, the way of the disciples. In Gnosticism, you get expressions of the way. So der Weg, I think, was a common expression. Find your own way, and he took this up and made a very serious thing out of it. Finding the way of the coming, and the way of the erring, and the way of the solitary, really, of the way of the deep, the way into the deep spirit, which has a connection, if you will, that struck him as being so astonishing with what the Chinese were doing precisely. And so then he thought, well, this is archetypal. Finding the way is an archetypal theme. It's an archetypal process. If anybody who in the world who takes themselves seriously and wants to live an authentic life will be on a way, and maybe they'll talk about it like this. So it's grounded in an archetypal process that's universal. It's worldwide, not just Eastern, but also Eastern.
Thank you. And one more question from Flat Rock, North Carolina. Are there any key terms in German that have problematic interpretations in English that we should be aware of? I know, Murray, you're very fluent in German, so you'd be a good one to ask that question of.
I collected a number of errors that people have sent me. People who are reading it in German, very fluent in German, and they say that a number of errors have been made. That's one category, mistakes. I don't think there are many mistakes. 3 translators worked on this. A professional translator here in Zurich did the first version, then an American poet, analyst went over it for English style and their levels of style, getting all that right. And then Sonu Shamdasani himself, who's quite fluent in German, checked it afterwards. And so there was a lot of discussion about how to do various terms and so on. If you read German, it's better, of course. It's the original language. I read it in German because, to me, it feels much closer to Jung. It's the way he thought, it's the way he spoke. It's a native language, and it feels more authentic to me. I did, as I was reading it, check in the English. Sometimes I wouldn't understand a passage in German. I look in the English. It was very helpful. So every translator has to make choices. I think the biggest one that I've heard about is this Übersinn, how to translate that concept, because it's a neologism. Jung created that word. And so how do you translate a word that doesn't exist in any German dictionary? It's never been used before. It's a new word into English. They chose, I think, supreme meaning, or maybe something like transcendent meaning. I think supreme meaning. It isn't very good translation. That's very debatable. Scrutinies is another one. That's an English word very seldom used for Prüfungen. Prüfungen really means tests. If you go to school and you're given a test, it's a Prüfung. Or if you test a metal to see, is it real or how tough is it, that's a Prüfung. So it really is testing something. And in that section, Jung is testing himself. Is he tough enough to pursue this solitary path? Can he really do it? And it's a story of him struggling to do it and struggling with himself. He's testing himself. Scrutinies, it's too distant for me. It's too, you scrutinize something from a distance, kind of critical looking. But his testing is a much more urgent, participating, active kind of putting you to the wall type of testing. That's what the Prüfungen are. So there are these questions about some of the translations. If you can read it in German, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, the English is pretty good. They certainly worked very hard on it, and translations are never perfect, but it's certainly not a bad translation.
Well, good. Well,
okay,
gosh,
Steve.
thank you so much, Murray.
Okay,
Really
it's my pleasure.
appreciate this.